Ashton Kinley achieved his Bachelor of Arts with a combined major in creative writing and cultural studies at the University of British Columbia. He is currently completing his MA in film studies at Concordia University in Montreal. His research explores the intersections of religion and settler colonial theories in Western Canadian mediascapes, seeking to challenge the hegemonic and iconographic narratives that articulate sensations of national belonging. His creative work has been screened at the first and second annual Kelowna Student Film Festival and the 2016 Words and AIDS. Am I saying that right? Is there supposed to be an either? Okay, I wasn't sure. Exhibition at the Kelowna Art Gallery, and his poetry has been published in Paper Shell. So please welcome Ashton.
Hi, I'm still seeing Delara's screen. Is that the case for everyone? Okay. So I will share mine. Just give me 1 second here. Oh yeah, okay. So good afternoon. I'm excited to be here in my bedroom up in Montreal. I just wanted to quickly thank the organizers of this conference for all their hard work in getting this running as smoothly as it has been. So the title of my presentation is Through the Hardships to the Stars, Points of Conradian Contact in Western Cinema, in which I will explore the screen legacy of Joseph Conrad's canonical colonial text, Heart of Darkness. Particularly, I'm interested in the continued endurance of this work as it relates to Western cinema. This presentation has been condensed from a much longer research paper, which goes into far more depth and detail than I can today. But for the sake of time, my presentation will be focusing specifically on a reading of James Gray's 2016 feature film, Velocity of Zed, to help illustrate contemporary representations of Heart of Darkness inspired works. So if anybody is interested in knowing more about this subject, feel free to reach out to me through Discord or however. I'd be happy to send the full PDF. And finally, I just thought I would quickly mention that the backgrounds of most of my presentation, or most of my slides, like this one here, come from the French post-impressionist painter Henri Rousseau, whose work inspired the look of the visual look of Lost City of Zed. So to begin, I wanted to quickly introduce and situate Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness as a particularly enduring text in the Western imaginary. Conrad was born in the mid-19th century and would go on to write numerous works that were often in discourse with early modernist concerns around European, imperial, and colonial pursuits. One of his most famous works, Heart of Darkness, a novella published in 1899, situates an imperial narrative that sees its European protagonist, Charles Marlowe, on his journey up the Congo River and into the depths of the African interior, where he encounters an ivory trader named Kurtz, whose prolific rise to power has turned him into a godlike figure in the region. This text has been widely analyzed and critiqued, with criticism directed towards the novel's perceived reproduction of racist and colonial attitudes towards Africa. Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe, for instance, notoriously decried the text and Conrad as a, quote, thoroughgoing racist, end quote. One of the key figures in post-colonial theory, Edward Said, was probably a little more favorable in his reading of Conrad's novella as a critique of the Western Empire's imperial pursuits. It's outside the boundaries of my work here to really unpack all of the century-plus critique of Conrad's novella, but more contemporary scholars of Conrad have offered new ways of thinking about the enduring legacy of his work. I've listed some of the scholars and critics here, if anybody's interested in further critical reading. So my presentation is interested in tracking the ways in which Heart of Darkness's contact-centered narrative continues to resonate with Western filmmakers. Particularly, I'm interested in cinematic representations of an imagined post-imperial contact that stage these encounters in relation to contemporaneous attitudes towards an increasingly globalized world. This slide shows just a list of some of the well-known films who owe inspiration to Heart of Darkness. Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now is perhaps the most famous adaptation of Conrad's novella. This project, however, began because I was interested in a recent string of films that I felt were dealing with similar Conrad-inspired narratives. These three films, 2015's Embrace of the Serpent, 2016's Lost City of Zed, and 2017's Zama, in one way or another, all felt directly indebted to Conrad's Heart of Darkness, with narratives that follow colonial figures encountering some form of indigenous other on their respective and often fraught journeys. So for the sake of time, I can't look at all of these in detail. So instead, I will turn to an analysis of the climactic colonial encounter with the other that takes place in James Gray's The Lost City of Zed. Gray's film comes in a time where the consequences of an increasingly globalized world coincide with Western nations' continued investments in the logics and power structures of colonialism and imperialism. The section of my longer paper that I'll be focusing on this presentation is titled The Sins of the Father, Empire and Absolution in James Gray's Lost City of Zed. In it, I will turn to a reading of the film's climactic encounter as a means of illustrating the shifting colonial temporalities of Conradian-inspired cinema. So to give some context for the sequence, Percy Fawcett, who in the film had been to the Amazon twice before, has retired as exploring after being injured in World War I. His relationship with Jack, his son, had been contentious up until this point, as Percy was often gone during Jack's childhood. Years into retirement, Jack convinces his father that they should return to the Amazon once more to finally find the mythical lost city, Zed, that had become a point of obsession for Percy. The sequence begins with the two emerging from the brush of an undisclosed location in the Amazon. They travel by canoe along the river, which is one of the key iconographic staples of Heart of Darkness narratives. As noted in one of the novella's most cited excerpts, quote, Thames and Congo, darkness and light, civilization and savagery, end quote. Early critics of Conrad had argued that this duality, the Thames standing in for Europe and the civilized, with the Congo standing in for an uncivilized Africa, sets up a problematic temporal distinction between the two continents, one of enlightened progress, the other shrouded in an unenlightened darkness. Others have pointed out that this binary isn't as fluid, stating that what Conrad was attempting to illuminate was that there was lightness and darkness in both. The Lost City of Zed certainly attempts to land closer to the latter reading. This is demonstrated in the moment that follows this journey up the river. As the Fawcetts make their way deeper into the jungle, they stumble upon an abandoned opera house, one that Percy had visited early on in the film during his first journey to the Amazon. The presence of the opera house in this story is a historical reference to the European rubber boom in South America during the 19th and early 20th centuries, which exploited both the land and the people, typically through violent means. The inclusion of opera houses and rubber empires in the Lost City of Zed is both a direct reference to the colonial history within the Amazon, as well as what appears to be an homage to Werner Herzog's Fitzcarraldo, which returns to my project's larger interest in tracing these intertextual connections. Percy and Jack Fawcett's encounter with the abandoned opera house in the Amazon can also be read as an extension of Heart of Darkness's religious symbolism, or what scholar Nadesh Latu calls, quote, an atheological perspective that inverses the telos of Christian meta-narratives of progress, end quote. One of the other components of Europe's civilizing mission was in bringing Christianity to places like the Amazon in order to assist in the cultural assimilation of its indigenous peoples. This falls back in line with Conrad's critique of imperialism in his novella, one that maps out the violence that accompanied this civilizing mission. Nature reclaiming the opera house in the Lost City of Zed, thus, can be read as a similar critique of the realization of empire that is on display in Fitzcarraldo, whose protagonist's corrupted spirit and obsession with wealth and cultural capital, properties of the 20th century European civilized subject, are as unavailing as his obsessive pursuits of rubber and opera houses. The abandonment of these same opera houses in Gray's film, and Percy's voiceover that states, quote, the jungle is restoring the balance, end quote, makes it clear that the film's temporal distinctions between the civilized Europe and uncivilized Amazon are just as murky as they are in Conrad's novella. After their visit to the abandoned opera house, a montage of the two's encounter with a local Amazonian village shows images of peaceful contact. To return to Chinua Achebe's critique of Conrad's novella, it is clear that Percy Fawcett's enlightenment in the film, which critics have pointed out was not entirely as virtuous in real life, still perpetuates harmful colonial stereotypes. Fawcett's enlightenment is much like, to borrow from Echeve's reading of Conrad's Marlowe, quote, the kind of liberalism that touched all the best minds of the age in England, Europe, and America, end quote. Fawcett has spent most of the film ingratiating himself into the culture of the Amazonian tribes he's come into contact with, ostensibly as a means of proving that they are as civilized as he and the British are back home. Indeed, the sequences back in London highlight this, with Fawcett arguing as much to members of the Royal Geographic Society. The film, however, hardly touches upon the ways in which this kind of liberalist attitude ignores the consequences of British Empire's imperial investments, like the rubber trade. Instead, the film favors an ambivalent engagement with the ultimate question of equality that privileges a post-enlightened perspective, where Fawcett is seen as an even more noble kind of colonial subject. That he vacates difference between himself and the tribe in this moment is evidence of his nobility. The next part of this sequence is an imagined version of what happened to the Fawcetts. In reality, they disappeared after setting off from their peaceful contacts in search of Zed, and were never heard from again. Theories spread, with the most accepted theory being that they were captured and killed by a hostile tribe. However, others have speculated that they may have found Zed and chosen to stay, an unlikely theory given that Fawcett had a wife and children back in England. Regardless, Gray's film offers an equally ambiguous conclusion, which speculates that the Fawcetts were indeed captured by a hostile tribe, seen here. However, what follows entirely subverts any easy answer as to what exactly became of the Fawcetts. Instead, Gray's film favors the ambiguity of the Fawcetts' disappearance in the staging of an aesthetically dreamy ritual ceremony, which refuses to show the Fawcetts' ultimate fate. This sequence subverts the expectation that this contact will end in the kind of violent clashes seen in many contact-driven narratives. Here, I think of the many scenes of extreme violence in a film like Apocalypse Now as an example. Gray doesn't give us this. Instead, the ritual is a kind of spiritual absolution for the Fawcetts, an achievement of their destined journey to Zed. Indeed, critics of the film have pointed out that Gray's aesthetic staging of this ritual ceremony and subversion of the kind of violence audiences are accustomed to is keeping in line with the film's moral and ethical critique of empire. Critic Dara O'Donoghue discusses the way the aesthetics of the sequence are reflective of the way that Fawcett, quote, crosses moral and spiritual borders from an aristocratic military colonial ethic in Europe, one based on rank, status, and distinction, to a literal loss of the self in the jungles of South America, end quote. Gray's critique of the systems of empire, that men like Percy and Jack Fawcett were sent on futile and perilous journeys in the state's colonial and imperialist interests, is matched equally with his supposition that it was in the nature of men like Percy and Jack Fawcett to seek out some kind of spiritual truth. And in this performed ritual, which ends with the drugged Fawcetts being carried off into the unknowns of the jungle, it would appear the Fawcetts have found it. As a quick digression, I feel it's important to mention that Gray's filmography, a sample of which is shown here on this slide, has often been dominated by themes of patrilineal legacy. Gray's male protagonists are typically torn between honoring their families, their fathers in particular, and forging their own paths towards an uncertain future. Gray's auteurist inclination towards patriarchal themes in this film is twofold. It can be considered a secondary thematic narrative through line to the film's staging of its ambivalent encounter. It is also, however, in this connection to Gray's other father and son-driven narratives that an even more complex relationship to Heart of Darkness emerges. Specifically, it moves from the secondary thematic space and becomes entangled directly into the staging of the climactic encounter. Here, I argue that it is Gray's contemporary attempt at absolving Western colonial subjects, like Percy Fawcett, of the sins of their father, which, in the Lost City of Zed's case, becomes the sins of empire. This absolution requires a kind of psychoanalytic reading of the climax of Gray's film. Scholars like Daphna Erdnas-Volkin have drawn upon psychoanalysis in their analyses of Heart of Darkness's Oedipal underpinnings. She looks back at Freud's Totem and Taboo to illustrate how Freud viewed totemistic cultures as being structured around an ambivalent primal father or ancestor, the totem. She ties this back in with Heart of Darkness in analyzing the relationship between Marlowe and Kurtz. who becomes a, quote, totemic being for Marlowe, as well as an embodiment of some of the originary presence to which Marlowe addresses his faith, end quote. Tracing the origins of religion and morality back to Freudian configurations is helpful in reading the Fawcett's encounter with the other as a direct reflection of this lineage. It further complicates analyses of Heart of Darkness that sees the Thames-Congo, Europe-Africa binary as a linear temporality between civilized and uncivilized cultures. Indeed, in positioning these ambivalent encounters with the other as an encounter with a totemic father figure, the Amazonian tribe in Gray's film ends up representing that same kind of totemic, godlike father that Kurt stood in for in Heart of Darkness. We can now understand the appeal of the Lost City of Zed's real-life narrative to an auteur like James Gray, whose films have largely considered the consequences of patrilineal legacies on the sons of totemic father figures. That the indigenous tribe stands in for a kind of holy father figure who, through the performance of this ritual, allow Percy and Jack to metaphorically and spiritually reach Zed is evidence of the film's desire for a post-imperial, post-modern temporality. The film's attempt at responsibly representing its indigenous characters and its attachment to Conrad's Heart of Darkness unintentionally ends up reproducing a kind of post-colonial fantasy that imagines the beneficiaries of the systems of the empire becoming absolved of its consequences. Well, I think The Lost City of Zed is actually quite a successful film and is worthy of recognition. It's impossible to ignore that this film's post-colonial fantasy continues in the tradition of Heart of Darkness's troubling engagement with race, as well as ongoing systems and structures of colonialism and imperialism that are indeed consequential. So throughout my reading of The Lost City of Zed, I have argued that the centering of the father and son narrative is an attempt to reconcile the consequences of empire that was foretold in Conrad's Heart of Darkness and then realized in films like Apocalypse Now and the many King Kong features. It stands to question then, where does this story go from here? What might a post-empire temporality look like? How might that shift the way filmmakers adapt Conrad moving forward? To answer these questions, I will conclude my presentation by quickly turning to James Gray's follow-up to Lost City, and arguably its spiritual sequel, the 2019 feature film Ad Astra starring Brad Pitt. For time's sake, I'm not going to go into much detail about the narrative of Ad Astra, but as I've mentioned, and I only half joke here, it basically retells the narrative of Gray's 2016 feature, but stages its contact-centered narrative in space. The film tracks Pitt's Roy McBride, an astronaut whose Conradian journey takes him into the literal darkness of our solar system, and eventually builds up to its main encounter with the other. The film's opening text affords us to see into the film's connection with Heart of Darkness, as well as some of the critical discourses and readings I've gone over. Humanity now turns their eyes away from the Congo and Amazon and looks to the unknown potentiality of the stars for answers. The implication that the near future is a time of both hope and conflict would suggest that our current globalized conflicts have been stretched even further, and I imagine more precariously. This kind of precarity that is on display in a film is on display in a film like Christopher Nolan's Interstellar, where the Earth has started to become uninhabitable due to the effects of climate change. Gray's film is less explicit in marking what exactly these conflicts look like, but its connection to Heart of Darkness, as well as the film's subtle critique of colonialism and imperialism, makes inferring this world state easier. This critique is laid out in the sequence where Roy McBride lands on the moon colony. As seen in this screenshot, corporations and capital have established themselves in space, the moon with an Applebee's. Roy McBride's first line of voiceover dialogue in this scene is, quote, "All the hopes we ever had for space travel covered up by drink stands and t-shirt vendors. Just a recreation of what we're running from on Earth," end quote. This rather on-the-nose voiceover quite clearly is critical of the kinds of institutions that would allow the moon to become colonized in the first place. In the same way that someone like Elon Musk's SpaceX might be trying to turn a profit on space tourism, the colony here on the moon is less about exploring the unknown than it is in making the unknown familiar. Indeed, this is an extension of Heart of Darkness's civilized-uncivilized binary, and Gray's cynicism here poises the audience to identify with McBride's more humanist journey, one that seeks to uncover, like Percy Fawcett's mythical city, an essential truth about humanity. So like Gray's previous film, Ad Astra blends Oedipal thematics with an ambivalence towards contact with otherness. This is particularly evident in the eventual contact that ends up taking place, which allows Gray to somewhat ambiguously answer the question proposed at the top of the film. Do the stars offer hope and progress? It's clear that Western filmmakers who continue to turn to Conrad as a source of inspiration might answer this question with the same degree of ambivalence that is staged in Heart of Darkness. Like the novella, these films in one way or another engage with Conrad's empire in tacit and strategic ways, whether it is to illuminate the monster hidden deep within the enlightened, whether it is to explicitly critique American imperialism, whether it is to unpack themes of human obsession and futility, whether it is an attempt to absolve colonialism of its sins, or whether it is in search of an ultimate truth. Whether other filmmakers follow up Gray's contemporizing of Heart of Darkness largely remains to be seen. As we all grapple with our continued global encounter with COVID-19, for instance, it seems that future engagements with Conrad's work will likely have to reckon with the kinds of globalized encounters that came out in its wake. Seeking out a kind of imagined futurity, whether it's Gray's imagined post-empire, or whether it's a futurity more critical of empire's amorphous present-day condition, means having to acknowledge the tension and paradoxical problematics of such temporal spaces. For who does this futurity encompass? And at whose expense does the cost of Western fantasies for lost cities, spiritual absolutions, and otherworldly contacts come from? Thank you. It's my works cited, and yes, thank you for listening.